I want to talk about the Gilded Age and try to summarize some of the bigger changes that are taking place then between the end of the Civil War and the end of the 19th century. Um, the big trends or developments include industrialization and urbanization, and certainly we want to make sure we understand what those terms mean. So what do we mean by industrialization? We mean this process that really began long before the Civil War, but really progresses more rapidly once the war has ended. The Republican Party is focused on growing the economy and westward expansion, including Indian wars, and is more interested in that ultimately than Reconstruction in the South, and invest federal money into improving transportation, communication, production. And so we see these pretty big changes taking place in these decades. The Northeast leads the way initially in terms of becoming industrialized, and Rhode Island will be, by the end of the century, the most intensely industrialized state in the country. Um, Something that will, in some ways, come back to haunt Rhode Island later on is a lot of those industries um, either come to an end or move elsewhere, and jobs, don't jobs just disappear. Um, the uh, the country really becomes urbanized too, and so by the end of the century, a tenth of Americans live in three very large cities: New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And Chicago in particular has just transformed incredibly quickly. Just a few decades before, Chicago didn't exist, and it was just a frontier trading post. And within a half century, it becomes one of the largest cities in the world. And the urban population overall across the country, the percentage doubles between 1850 and 1900, from about a sixth of the nation's population living in cities to about a third of the population living in cities. And it's an increasingly diverse population. So along with urbanization, we see immigration, and there are a lot more Jews, a lot more Catholics, entering the United States in the later years of the 19th century. Up until that point, up until the Civil War, really, the U.S. is overwhelmingly a Protestant country. But starting in the last few decades of the 19th century, religious diversity will be a much more prominent characteristic of the United States. Most Americans still live on farms, of course, but their lives are now affected by cities in new ways, and railroads crisscross the continent. You have mail order catalogs like the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and other new corporations are connecting people, even if they live in remote parts of the continent, connecting them to urban centers more than ever before. We also see with industrialization, the United States becoming a major economic power. So before the Civil War, the U.S. is fourth in the world behind Great Britain, France, and Germany in terms of its industrial production. That's fourth in the nation, fourth in the world rather, is still pretty high. But by 1900, the United States is not only first, but is producing more than the next three largest economies combined. And so we see again this really rapid transformation to an industrial powerhouse nation. So what made the United States so successful? Um, I think it boils down to a few different things, and we can look at the large national market as being pretty important. There's some global trade, certainly, even in these years, and even as you know from earlier in this course, there's global trade from the very beginnings of European exploration and conquest of the Americas. But still, having such a large unitary market at home allows for economic expansion um, and development. Similarly, you have a large agricultural interior that's helped by all sorts of government spending and investment, developing irrigation, developing transportation networks to get crops from relatively remote agricultural production areas in the Midwest and the West to population centers, mostly in the East. Um, a lot of taxpayer money, invest in infrastructure to make this happen, but once it's there, agricultural production in the United States is extraordinarily high. Um, by the late 19th century, the U.S. is producing way more food than Americans themselves can consume, and so the United States is exporting a lot of agricultural products. Um, a third thing is the transportation and communication revolutions that occurred before the Civil War. So just like with infrastructure that I just mentioned, the transportation networks, the communication networks that are built really lay the foundations for the industrial expansion later on. Probably more significant is the legal structure that allows for free enterprise to develop fairly easily. There's regulation, certainly, and there always has been, going back to the colonial period. We looked at some of the restrictions that colonial societies placed on merchants and setting prices and things like that. And states, since the early national period, had regulated businesses, encouraging development and regulating at the same time through the use of corporate charters, where a state would charter a corporation, but in that charter would lay out, essentially the rules that corporation had to follow to make sure that the corporation served the public interest. Um, in post-Civil War times, that model changes quite a bit, and states are incorporating corporations without those kinds of regulations and restrictions, and the federal government begins to involve itself more in the economy in the Civil War and afterwards, but initially only promoting growth, and really with the state stepping back and the federal government not yet stepping in, which won't occur until the 20th century, there isn't much regulation in the late 19th century. And so it's a little bit of a free-for-all, which leads to rapid expansion, but also leads to some catastrophic collapses, as well as pretty intense fights between labor and capital. And I mean literally fights in this period. There's a lot of violence, as there is no mediation from any kind of government structure. Um, and um, and massive failures. So railroads, banks collapse, causing Great Depressions in the 1870s, again in the 1890s, because there has been no oversight, no regulation. And incorporation, which I mentioned just now, is itself an important legal structure. This allows people to lessen the risks associated with starting a new business when they incorporate, rather than put their personal wealth on the line. It allows for essentially a risk-free investment. If the company fails, they're not on the hook, they're not liable because they've incorporated. So this encourages investment. This encourages beginning new businesses, starting new businesses. The first of the really large corporations in the U.S. are railroads, and they had to create completely new systems of management because now we're dealing with a national corporation for the first time that also required local staff all over the place. And so they came up with this hierarchical management system that basically followed the military. They used kind of a military system of hierarchy to take the place of smaller scale operations with single managers, single business owners. Middle management then grows exponentially in the decades after the Civil War, as you need all these new managers, in these various ranks in these very large national corporation. Railroads introduced standardized accounting procedures and new systems. There's literally a book. The phrase "do it by the book" refers to this book that lays out the standard operating procedures for these railroads. And they create time zones in 1883. This isn't a government initiative. This is the railroad corporations deciding that they needed to establish time zones, as now they're operating these national rail networks. Congress then adopts these time zones and says, "Oh, let's make it official." But the railroads set up these time zones because it was too confusing, not knowing what local time actually was. Um, the big difference between the U.S. and other countries in this period is again, the lack of regulation and oversight. And with railroads, most other developed nations or developing nations are building national railroad networks. They're publicly owned, state-run railroads. In the U.S., of course, these are privately owned businesses, although they're given huge land and money subsidies by the federal government. Um, and rather than investing, though, directly into planning this national transportation system, the US government simply offers up cheap, free land, tax breaks, and then lets these companies and individuals figure out for themselves where to build rail networks. So this leads to a lot of corruption, an incredible amount of corruption. It leads to exploitation of workers, in particular Chinese laborers in the West, Irish laborers in the East. They do most of the work on the rails. It leads to a chaotic and unstable system where a regional railroad might suddenly go out of business, and then there's no railroad in that region. On the other hand, it grows the network more quickly than anywhere else in the world, and you have this very quick completion of the Transcontinental Railroad right after the Civil War, more miles of track laid than in any other country. And between 1870 and 1890, the amount of rail mileage triples in the U.S. So it's a corrupt system, it's an exploitative system, it leads to all sorts of problems, and it's also really effective at getting the job done quickly. So, that's what you get. Um, Railroads are at the heart of many of the political scandals of the period, too, beginning with the Grant administration. Um, I think I won't get into this really here, but it's in the textbook chapters on this period. You can read about these scandals, but Grant himself was seen as completely honest, uncorruptible, but various members of his administration were caught up in a few different scandals, and these involved bribery and finance schemes. That usually involve railroads and other large corporations in this period. But it does have an effect politically in that Grant himself, is sort of diminished in the public eye, and his party, the Republican Party, is kind of linked to a lot of this corruption as well. This helps then lead to the end of Reconstruction in 1877. This follows the contested presidential election of 1876, the centennial, of course, of the United States. And Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican, Samuel Tilden is the Democrat. Both of them run as good government reformers. They want to clean up the corruption, and both of them favored a return to white rule in the South, redemption, it was called. The Republicans, though, waved the bloody shirt. That was the phrase. They said that every man that tried to destroy this nation was a Democrat. The man that assassinated Lincoln was a Democrat. And they tried to, turn the Democratic candidate into a traitor. Still, Tilden, the Democrat, wins the popular vote overall. But we know that, of course, in the South, many black voters are disenfranchised. Many white voters who have expressed support for Republicans are disenfranchised. There's a lot of fraud in various cities in the North as well as in the South. The Electoral College vote then was very close, and because it was contested in several states, and there were challenges all over the place to the legitimacy of this election, Congress created a bipartisan committee to resolve the situation. And you have 8 Republicans on the committee and 7 Democrats. 8 Republicans voted for Hayes to become president, 7 Democrats voted for Tilden. Um, but a deal was struck to ensure that Southern and Democratic support would line up behind Hayes in exchange for an immediate end to Reconstruction and a return to white rule or redemption in the South. So the Republican Party, in short, which a few years before had been led by these idealists, these radicals in Congress who insisted that Reconstruction should reform the South, has now essentially sold out the South, sold out the freedmen in exchange for presidential power and their candidate winning office, Rutherford B. Hayes. And that's how Reconstruction comes to an end. And basically going forward then, there's very little national support for the former slaves in the South, and white Southerners are able to rule that region as they want to. Um, this is the period then that's referred to by Mark Twain, one of our greatest authors certainly, who's becoming well known by the 1870s. He refers to this period as the Gilded Age, and this references the role of money in politics, as well as the shallowness of political debates. And you have a series of close national elections between the two major parties, and there's very little significant difference between the parties at this point. Um, Local issues were much more important than national issues to most voters. National issues had to do with monetary policy, tariffs, lower tariffs, raise tariffs. Most voters didn't care about such things. They were more focused on local issues, including temperance and prohibition and alcohol. Immigrant populations tended to vote on cultural issues, including alcohol, and were not very interested in national politics either. But voter turnout was high and remained very high, approaching 80%, 90% in some of these elections, compared to 30 to 40% in earlier periods, around 50% today. Voters believed they received very direct benefits from the system, and in fact, they often did. So in many cities, north, south, east, west, you had these political machines. Tammany Hall in New York is maybe the most famous of these, but pretty much every city and most states had political machines where you had these bosses who didn't necessarily hold office themselves, but basically ran one particular party and controlled all sorts of job access in state government, controlled contracts, that were awarded to build a new state building or city building. And so these political machines would give people jobs. They would give them money when they needed it, as long as they supported the political machines candidates when it came to election time. And so for immigrants in particular, just off the boat, looking for a place to stay, looking for a job, the machine would help them out, get them set up, and then they in turn repaid by always voting for whatever machine, whatever party that machine was part of, Republican or Democrat. Businesses got subsidies if they were part of the machine system. They got contracts, they got inside information about when to bid. Their bids were accepted because they were part of the machine. So like I said, it's very corrupt, but on the other hand, people felt like and did in fact receive direct benefits from participating, and that's why participation was so high. And then, of course, the national story is that Southern whites are trying to end Reconstruction and redeem the South. Republicans are initially trying to reconstruct the South, but as I said, abandon that by the mid-1870s in exchange for continued rule in Washington. And the Republican Party gets to be much more focused on business. And sort of Wall Street Republicans kind of move in to seize control of the party going forward. There's a whole other story here in this period with civil service reform that I don't want to spend much time on, but really briefly, both parties have these civil service reformers who are interested in trying to end some of the corruption. They go after the machines in their home states or home cities. They try to adopt civil service reform locally at the state level and nationally, and they have some successes. So James A. Garfield. Um, Skipping ahead a few election cycles in 1880, runs on a civil service reform platform, and this eventually leads to the Pendleton Act in 1883, which is passed in the wake of Garfield's assassination. Garfield was killed by Charles Guiteau, who was a man who had a job in the federal government because of the old spoils system, where basically a party would come into power in Washington, the presidents would, get to appoint all these new positions, and the Pendleton Act was meant to clean that up so that instead of just having political appointees, you had career bureaucrats, career civil service workers who didn't owe their job to one side or the other and could focus on doing their job rather than pleasing their political bosses. So civil service reform is also part of this period in the story. So getting back to industrialization, the late 19th century is known much more for these captains of industry like Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, um, uh, Swift, Morgan. These are the names that we associate with the 19th century, Vanderbilt, et cetera, more than um, the political leaders like Garfield, Hayes, Chester Arthur, um, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, even. Cleveland's probably the best known of all of these late 19th century presidents, but even he doesn't accomplish very much. Most of these industrial giants get their start in railroads. They learn management working at railroads. That's true of Carnegie. That's true of J.P. Morgan. That's true of Gustavus Swift. Swift is maybe the least famous of those that I just mentioned, and what he does is revolutionize beef manufacturing and shipping, and he's responsible for Americans eating way too much beef in the 20th century and still today, because he's the one who comes up with ways to ship beef from the West and the Midwest to eastern cities. Um, some of the changes then that we see in American society as a result of these larger developments that I mentioned earlier, that small local shops begin to disappear, and we start to see the replacement by larger chains, catalog companies like Sears. Social mobility decreases, and people who find themselves in low-wage factory jobs find that there is not really any opportunity for advancement. These aren't jobs that lead to promotions and lead to something better down the road. There's a whole class of Americans that is basically consigned to low-wage factory work. Their children are consigned. Their grandchildren, are mostly consigned to low-wage factory work. There's not really many opportunities for advancement out of the working class anymore. And so social mobility really declines in this period. This leads to people questioning the whole ideology of free labor, which we talked about a little earlier in the course. The idea that individual workers were free to choose for themselves who to work for and set their own wages. This is challenged by unionists, labor union, enthusiasts, supporters, who believe that the only way that workers can advance their cause now is collectively, that there's no room for individual workers to fight for their wages, to fight for their rights, to fight for their safety. They just don't amount to much in the grand scheme of things on an individual basis. They're easily fired and replaced. But if they band together and fight collectively and negotiate collectively, then they have some power. So this becomes a pretty key battle that I'll come back to later on, maybe in the next lecture. And sort of related to that, you have these much larger work environments, less personal work environments. People don't tend to work as closely with their superiors, their managers, their uh, company owners certainly are very far removed. Um, and you have this real division of labor between skilled work, which tended to go to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, um, born in the United States with many generations born in the United States in most cases, and then unskilled labor reserved for recent immigrants, the children of recent immigrants, um, and so some real divides in American society there. Um, and you have this new middle class, growing middle class in this corporate hierarchy. So all these new middle managers kind of form this new professional middle class. And so you have an expanding middle class as well. But again, these are jobs that are reserved for certain people. And other jobs are reserved for unskilled laborers, mainly coming from um, Southern and Eastern Europe by the end of the century, and on the West Coast from Asia as well. So I think in this course I want to kind of breeze through this, and so I'm not going to get into um, some examples of these captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller. But I think there's enough in the textbooks that you get a sense of what they did and what they accomplished and how they did it, and both the negative and the positive effects of their rise. Um, but instead, I want to focus on some of these conflicts then between capital and labor that develop. And you see a number of labor unions that develop in the second half of the 19th century. And I'll just mention, the more important ones. You have the Knights of Labor, uh, which is really the first of the national labor unions. Um, they're kind of a brotherhood, um, originally secretive, kind of a secret organization. They have a very wide net in terms of who can participate. Reformist goals. They're pushing for an 8-hour workday. They're pushing for the federal government to manage land in the West. They're pushing for child labor laws and female labor laws. So they're kind of all over the place in terms of reform. They don't believe in strikes. They believe instead in boycotts. So they want to, encourage consumers of goods to boycott companies that are engaging in unfair labor practices rather than workers going out on strike. They believe in free labor. They want to restore the idea of the independent craftsman. Um, and so in many ways, they're kind of a backward-looking organization. They want to revert back to an earlier economic model um, that really doesn't work out, in the end. And so they eventually collapse during the Depression of 1893. But from the 1870s through the Depression of 1893, the Knights of Labor is a pretty substantial power, and grows very rapidly. The longer term success goes to the American Federation of Labor, which is founded just a little bit later than the Knights of Labor. AFL was founded in 1886, and the AFL is led by a man named Samuel Gompers. Gompers is much less political, much less interested in reform, focused instead on jobs and wages. And he wants to improve wages for the membership of the AFL, what he calls the bread and butter issues. AFL is based on this federation idea, this federation of craft unions. So you have skilled laborers in the cigar makers union, which Gompers comes out of. That's a skilled job in those days. You have skilled workers, who are working in factories, which have both unskilled and skilled jobs. The unskilled workers are not invited to join the AFL, but the skilled workers, the minority, but the better educated and usually the native-born white Americans, they're the ones who are invited to join the AFL in these years. Um, they so there's federation of unions, but they also involve high dues, and so you pay dues that go to the national organization, so that when the locals have problems and they need to go out on strike or some other issue, the national organization can funnel money to that local that needs the money at that moment. And so it shares the money according to need. It's much more practical and much more effective ultimately, and helps the AFL to weather short-term storms and outlast other labor unions that are formed in this period. Um, so there are a number of conflicts that we could look at. Again, I don't want to get bogged down too much in details in these short lectures, but you should look at the Homestead Strike in 1892. This occurs at one of Andrew Carnegie's big plants in Homestead, Pennsylvania, a steel plant, and Carnegie's right-hand man, Henry Clay Frick, was left in charge of the plant after Carnegie leaves town, and Frick de-recognizes the union, which Carnegie had formally recognized, and the union then goes out on strike. Frick responds by shutting down the Homestead plant. He calls in the Pinkertons, this detective agency that by this period, by the 1890s, is basically acting as hired guards, some might say hired thugs, to kind of bust up unions when they go out on strike, and use violence to intimidate workers to try to end strikes. So Frick calls in the Pinkerton detectives to Homestead. But the union and its supporters won't allow the Pinkertons in, and so the Pinkertons try to sail up the Monongahela River into Homestead, but they're attacked, and there's this whole fight, this whole gunfight that eventually leads to the Pinkertons' surrender. The governor orders the National Guard in, though, to occupy the factory, arrest the mayor, the union leaders. The strike breakers then come in, and the strike comes to an end with Frick and Carnegie winning. But it's in some ways a hollow victory, as America is witnessing this stuff and seeing what a disaster this all is, and the labor strife that we see not just in this one case, but in a whole series of cases like this from the 1870s through the 1890s, is pretty terrifying to a lot of Americans. This is a period when a lot of U.S. cities, in fact, are redeveloped so that elite Americans feel safer. They're worried about worker violence. They're worried about this conflict between workers and their bosses, who are members of the elite. And you have the construction of armories in a lot of cities, and these armories are meant so that if the workers get out of control, the elite citizens can go to the armory and get the weapons they need to shoot the workers and reassert control. So it's not just Homestead, it's a whole series of incidents like the one I just described very briefly for you that mark this late 19th century period as an age of conflict between capital and labor. There are a number of ways that people propose to deal with this, and when we talk about the progressive era later on in the course, coming up pretty soon, I'll kind of go back and review some of the earlier reform efforts, but I think for now I'll just kind of leave you with this idea that it's a period of a pretty intense conflict and pretty intense strife.